Hello, everyone. So what I want to talk to you about today is how the Black Death spread during the very earliest phases of transmission. We're going to set aside, just for the moment, the question of where and when the Black Death outbreak, the plague outbreak that happened between 1346 and 1351, we're going to leave aside the question of exactly where and exactly when it started, and we're going to focus on early transmission into the Mediterranean because that's the region where we start to have really good documentation. So how did it get into the Mediterranean? That's the question for today. Most textbooks, when they talk about this, say that the first point of spread into the Mediterranean was a city called Kaffa in the Black Sea, and I'm showing you a picture here of Kaffa, what it looks like today. It's now called Feodosia. So they say this relying on a plague treatise by a notary named Gabriele de Musis. He said that the Mongol army, which was besieging Kaffa in 1347, was affected by this disease and that they wanted to use it as part of their siege. So they threw dead bodies, people who had died of this mysterious disease, they didn't know what it was yet. They threw dead bodies over the walls, and this infected the people on the inside of the city, and the infected survivors fled in ships to the Mediterranean, and that's how you get plague spreading through the Mediterranean. People trying to escape from this siege. So I Googled this and found this amazing picture of plague being catapulted over the walls of Kaffa. So there you have it. That's Gabriele de Musis. Okay, there's a problem with this. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really make sense because we know that the Black Death outbreak, the disease of plague, is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. And we know that Yersinia pestis is transmitted in a couple of ways to human beings. It can be transmitted via insects that have been biting rodents that are affected. And I gave you some examples here. We normally talk about rats, but we can also talk about marmots and prairie dogs and other kinds of mammals as well, but particularly rodents of various kinds. So it can be transmitted from rodents via insects, fleas, but other kinds of insects as well to humans. If the insects bite the rodents and then they bite the people, they transmit the bacteria. We also know that Yersinia pestis can be transmitted, so people can catch plague by coughing. If someone has an infection of Yersinia pestis in their lungs and they cough right in the face of another human being, and that person breathes any of the bacteria in, it's possible to catch plague in that way as well. That form is called pneumonic plague when it's in the lungs as opposed to in the bloodstream or the lymph system. It's possible that it could be transmitted from person to person through human fleas or human lice. This is an area where entomologists are doing research, so I'm just putting it on here as a possibility. We don't know for sure. One thing we know, though, is that plague is not transmitted from dead human bodies to living human bodies. There's all these other possibilities, but throwing dead bodies over the wall to try to infect living people just doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of what we know about how the plague actually works. So when I teach my students, I always ask them every time we read any primary source that they need to ask themselves a couple of questions, right? They need to ask themselves who wrote the source, where, when, and why. And when we're talking about medieval sources, sometimes those questions are easy to answer, but sometimes they're actually quite difficult. So I want to ask these questions about Gabriele de Musis, right? Who was he? He was a notary. He was a legal professional, someone who drew up legal documents, in the correct way. Living in a town called Piacenza, and he wrote his treatise about the Black Death. The purpose of it was to describe this major event that happened during his lifetime. And he wrote it sometime before 1356. So the outbreak got to Piacenza in 1348, so it must have been after that. He died in 1356, so it was sometime before he died, sometime between 1348 and 1356. Okay, here's the problem. Let's look at a map. Piacenza is over on the left. Kaffa, the city where this supposedly all took place, is on the right. These are not close together, right? Gabriele de Musis was not an eyewitness to anything that was going on in Kaffa, And there weren't necessarily a whole lot of people from Piacenza in Caffa either. There were other groups of Italians who might have been there, but Piacenza, not the main group. So we might want to ask ourselves whether we can do better, right? If we want to tell the story of the beginning of this really important historical event, is there any better source that we can find to describe this than someone who was not there and not anywhere close? And the quick answer is yes, we have another source, and that's what this video is about. It's a petition from the residents of Caffa in 1347. And you have the file attached, so you can go look at the petition, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background information right now. So this town of Caffa was a port on the Crimean Peninsula, and it was part of a whole colonial empire of ports and islands that was controlled by Genoa. So first of all, lots of Italians in Caffa, but they're especially from Genoa rather than Piacenza because this is one of their colonies. People go back and forth between Genoa and Caffa all the time. The purpose of this colonial empire, especially, you can see it's not focused on controlling large amounts of territory. It's focused on controlling strategic pieces of territory. These are ports and islands that are strategic for trade and for shipping. That's what Genoa was really interested in. They were interested in competing with Venice for shipping and transportation and commercial control over the Eastern Mediterranean. So within the Black Sea part of this empire, Caffa was the hub. This was the main colony for Genoa in the Black Sea. What were they trading there? They were trading grain. This is really important because Genoa was in a very mountainous region. They couldn't grow enough grain locally to feed this very large city. They traded slaves, they traded fish, they traded caviar during this period, various other kinds of local goods. But this was also an important port because it gave the Genoese access to the Silk Road network. So here I'm showing you just a map of the Silk Road network, and you can see Caffa is at a strategic point, right? The Silk Road network at this point in time was controlled by 4 Mongol states. The one that we're concerned with right now is the Golden Horde. This is the immediate inland neighbor of Caffa and of these Genoese people living in this colony. So the thing is this, Caffa is a major trade hub, both for local and regional trade and for this long distance Silk Road network trade, which is very valuable. So whoever gets to collect the export taxes in Caffa can make a lot of money. And what was going on in the 1340s was that Genoa and the Golden Horde were in competition over who would control Caffa and therefore who would get to collect the taxes in Caffa. Genoa had already established this colony there, initially with permission from the Golden Horde, but it was unwritten permission. They had never signed a formal written treaty. And what happened starting in 1343 was the rulers of the Golden Horde, the Khans, decided, perhaps we don't want to have the Genoese have a colony in Caffa anymore. This led to a war, kind of an on and off war. It wasn't going continuously throughout the 1340s, but the siege in question here, the siege where maybe people were throwing bodies over walls or perhaps they weren't, this siege between 1345 and 1347, this was siege number 2 in a series of 3 sieges of Caffa. Since this was the main focus of the war, a lot of the fighting was going on in this region and affected Caffa directly. In the end, Genoa won. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but by the time we get into the 1350s and definitely the 1360s, their control over this colony was secured. But I want to go back to this petition, right? This petition from the residents of Caffa. So who wrote it, where, when, and why? The people who wrote it were people who were living in Caffa, where they wrote it in Caffa at home. When 1347, so this is right at the period when plague is starting to spread into the Mediterranean, and probably it was written in February or March. The explanation for this is sort of complicated, but essentially it's early in the year, right after the siege has been lifted, but right before the spring shipping season starts. Winter sailing in the Mediterranean, or in the Black Sea rather, is dangerous. Normally ships start to sail in March. So if this petition was written to go on the first ship out of Caffa to get to Genoa, it would probably have been February or March. This is the first reference in a European source to the Black Death period. And it comes from what seems to be the first point of transmission of the Black Death into the Mediterranean. So in terms of people who are in the right place and in the right time and should know what they're talking about, this is about as good as it gets. I'm going to leave the analysis of the source to you, but the questions I would suggest you consider are these. In this petition, so the first question is really why, right? In this petition, the inhabitants of Kaffa are asking for money, soldiers, and a bishop. Why? Why do they need those things? Why are they asking the Doge of Genoa specifically to send them those things? Why are they writing this petition? The second question is turning it towards this question of disease, right? At the time when the petition was written, had anyone in Kaffa caught plague? Had anyone shown symptoms of being sick? If so, which symptoms do you see mentioned in the petition? If not, why is the petition talking about a disease outbreak if it hasn't actually affected anyone in the city? Then I want you to compare what this source, this petition, says about the early transmission of Black Death with the story of Gabriele de Mussis. I summarized it for you, but I also give you a link and you can look at the way he described it in more detail. Which version makes more sense? And you can answer this question on two levels. You can talk about it in terms of our modern medical understanding of how Yersinia pestis and plague as a disease of human beings, how that works. Or you can answer it in a medieval sense, based on what medieval people believed about disease and contagion and how the spread of a disease like plague would work. Which of these explanations makes more sense? The last thing I would suggest is comparing this petition with other sources that talk about early transmission of the Black Death and do a broader sort of comparison. What similarities do you see? What differences do you see? What do those differences imply? Thank you.